When the metal giants of war rolled through the French countryside in 1940, no one imagined that an ordinary farmer with calloused hands and a stubborn spirit would craft a weapon capable of piercing armor that resisted even military artillery. This is the story of Henri Dubois, a man who transformed desperation into ingenuity and a simple hunting shotgun into a tool that would earn whispered legends among resistance fighters across occupied France. The morning of June 14, 1940, arrived with an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the usual sounds of the farm. Henri stood at the edge of his wheat field, watching columns of smoke rise from distant villages. The air carried the acrid smell of burning timber and rubber. At 52 years old, his weathered face bore the lines of countless seasons working the land his grandfather had tilled. His hands, strong from decades of labor, now trembled slightly as he gripped the wooden fence post. His wife Marie called from the farmhouse doorway, her voice strained with worry that she tried to mask with routine. Their son, Thomas, just 19, stood beside his father, his young face tight with the fear and confusion that comes when the world you know begins to crumble. The German army was advancing, and everyone knew what that meant. The stories from Poland, from Belgium, had reached even their remote corner of Normandy. Before we continue with Henri's story, if you're finding this tale compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of remarkable individuals who changed history in unexpected ways. The occupation arrived not with dramatic fanfare, but with a grinding mechanical efficiency that was somehow more terrifying. Within days, German troops established checkpoints on every major road. Henri watched from his fields as convoys of vehicles passed, their engines rumbling like approaching thunder. Among them, the light-armored cars particularly caught his attention. These ZKFZ vehicles, with their sloped metal plating, seemed invincible to the farmers and townspeople who had only hunting rifles and ancient weapons left from the previous war. The Germans requisitioned grain, livestock, equipment. They were methodical, documenting everything in their precise ledgers. An officer, speaking adequate French, explained the new order of things. Compliance meant survival. Resistance meant consequences. The words hung in the air like a sentence already passed. Henri had always been a practical man, more comfortable with machines and tools than with words. His small workshop behind the barn held years of accumulated knowledge, tools inherited and modified, devices he had built to solve problems that arose on a working farm. He had repaired tractors, welded broken plows, even rebuilt the engine of an old truck that everyone said was beyond saving. This practical ingenuity, born from necessity and refined through experience, would soon take on a far more dangerous purpose. The transformation began with anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, calculating anger that settles in when you watch your neighbors forced from their homes, when you see young men rounded up for labor camps, when you witness an elderly shopkeeper beaten for failing to remove his hat quickly enough when soldiers passed. Thomas wanted to fight immediately, to join whatever resistance might be forming, but Henri held him back. Fighting required more than courage, he insisted. It required tools, planning, and most importantly, effectiveness. The shotgun had belonged to Henri's father, a well-maintained Darn side-by-side 12-gauge that had brought down countless birds and the occasional boar. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, its walnut stock worn smooth by decades of use, but against steel armor, its lead shot would scatter harmlessly. Henri understood ballistics from years of hunting. He knew that velocity, mass, and penetration were the key factors. Standard shot shells were designed to spread, to cover area. What he needed was concentration, focused force delivered to a single point. Late into the night, after Marie and Thomas had gone to bed, Henri worked in his shop by the light of a single oil lamp. The Germans had established a curfew and prohibited lights after dark, but his workshop windows faced away from the road, and thick curtains concealed even the faintest glow. He began with research, pulling out old books on metallurgy, hunting journals that discussed ammunition, even his son's physics textbooks from school. The concept formed gradually. Instead of multiple pellets, a single solid projectile. Instead of lead, something harder. Steel would be ideal, but raw steel lacked the density needed. Then he remembered the old tractor parts in the corner of his barn. Weights made from tungsten alloy. Tungsten, he knew from his reading, was incredibly dense and hard, used in tools that cut other metals. If he could fashion projectiles from this material, shape them correctly, and load them with enough powder to achieve high velocity, he might create something capable of penetrating thin armor. The technical challenges were immense. The shotgun's smooth bore, designed for shot shells, would not stabilize a single projectile the way a rifle's spiral grooves would. The projectile would tumble in flight, reducing accuracy and penetration. Henri needed to create a projectile that would remain stable through sheer design. Perhaps with fins like the arrows he had seen in drawings of ancient warfare, or with a shape that naturally stabilized in flight. He started with wooden mock-ups, carving different shapes, testing them by throwing them through the air to observe their flight characteristics. He felt slightly foolish, a grown man throwing carved sticks in his workshop, but each test taught him something. Certain shapes tumbled immediately, others flew straighter. He began to understand the principle of aerodynamic stability, how the center of pressure and center of gravity needed to align. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. His neighbor, old Jacques Mercier, had been a machinist in Paris before retiring to the countryside. Jacques had worked in factories that produced components for aircraft, and he understood principles of design that Henri only grasped intuitively. When Henri cautiously approached him, speaking in vague terms about a project, Jacques understood immediately. The old man's eyes, still sharp despite his 70 years, gleamed with something between excitement and fear. Jacques invited Henri to his own workshop, a cluttered space filled with lathes, drill presses, and measuring instruments of impressive precision. Together, working only during hours when prying eyes were unlikely, they designed the projectile. It would be a solid tungsten core, cylindrical with a pointed nose, weighing nearly 2 ounces. Shallow grooves cut into the base would create a primitive form of spin stabilization as gases from the powder charge expanded around it. The projectile would be encased in a copper jacket to protect the shotgun's barrel from the harder tungsten. Creating the ammunition was painstakingly slow work. Each projectile had to be machined individually on Jacques' lathe, with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, too large, and the projectile would jam in the barrel, potentially causing a catastrophic failure. Too small, and gases would escape around it, reducing velocity and pressure. The copper jackets had to be formed from salvaged pipes, heated, hammered, and carefully shaped. The powder charge presented another challenge. Standard shotgun shells contained relatively mild loads, designed for patterns of shot, rather than driving a heavy projectile to high velocity. Henri needed more power, but too much would destroy the shotgun, or worse, injure him. He experimented cautiously, starting with standard loads and gradually increasing the powder, testing each variation by firing into a thick oak log from a safe distance, with the shotgun secured in a vise. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a bitter cold that made working in the unheated workshop almost unbearable. Henri's fingers would go numb handling the metal components, and more than once he had to stop work to warm them by the small stove before he could continue. But the cold also brought advantages. The Germans seemed less inclined to patrol the rural areas extensively, and the shortened days meant more hours of concealing darkness. By February of 1941, Henri had produced 6 functioning rounds. Each one represented weeks of work, but he finally felt ready to conduct a real test. The question was how to test armor penetration without drawing attention. Firing weapons was strictly forbidden for civilians, and the sound of gunshots would bring immediate investigation. The solution came from an unlikely place. One of the German convoys had an accident on the icy road near Henri's farm. A supply truck skidded off the road and into a ditch, its rear axle broken. The Germans salvaged what they could, but left the damaged truck, intending to return with proper recovery equipment. But winter storms kept the roads impassable for weeks, and by the time conditions improved, the Wehrmacht had apparently forgotten about one broken truck in a sea of military operations across Europe. Henri and Thomas worked at night, carefully removing several steel plates from the truck's cargo bed. These weren't armor, just structural steel about 3 millimeters thick, but they would serve for initial testing. They also found, buried under snow near the crash site, a section of the truck's hood, which was slightly thicker and might approximate the light armor on some vehicles. The test firing took place in a ravine on Henri's property, a natural depression where the sound would be muffled by the surrounding earth. Henri set up the target plates at 20 meters, the distance he estimated he might realistically engage a vehicle. His hands were steady as he loaded the first round, though his heart hammered in his chest. This moment represented months of work, risk, and hope. If the ammunition failed, he would have to start over, reconsider everything. If it succeeded, he would possess something valuable, something that might actually matter in the grinding war of occupation and resistance. Thomas stood beside him, serving as a spotter. Marie had refused to come, unable to watch her husband potentially injure himself with a weapon that might explode. But she had given her reluctant blessing, understanding that doing nothing was its own kind of danger. Henri raised the shotgun, feeling its familiar weight against his shoulder. He aligned the front bead with the steel plate and squeezed the trigger. The report was thunderous, much louder than a standard shotgun blast, and the recoil slammed back against his shoulder with bruising force. For a moment, smoke and the echoing blast left him disoriented. Then Thomas was shouting, running toward the target. The tungsten projectile had punched clean through the 3-millimeter steel plate, leaving a neat hole surrounded by petalled metal where the material had been pushed outward by the impact. On the thicker section of hood, the projectile had penetrated but not completely through, instead creating a deep crater with visible cracks radiating outward. Henri's hands trembled as he examined the damage. It had worked. Against all odds, his improvised armor-piercing round had succeeded, but success brought new complications. The shotgun had been damaged by the excessive pressure, a crack appearing in the wooden forestock. The barrel, though intact, showed signs of stress. Henri realized he would need to reinforce the weapon if it was to survive multiple firings. More importantly, he now possessed something the resistance could use, which meant he had to decide what to do with this knowledge. The decision was made for him 2 weeks later when German troops conducted a sweep through the area, searching for resistance members who had sabotaged a rail line. They entered Henri's farm at dawn, rough and suspicious, searching the barn and house with methodical thoroughness. Henri watched, his face impassive, as they overturned furniture and dumped grain stores. They found nothing, of course. The shotgun, its experimental ammunition, and all tools that might reveal his work were hidden in a space beneath the workshop floor, concealed behind a false wall Henri had constructed years ago to hide valuables from thieves. But they took Thomas. The Germans were rounding up young men, claiming they needed workers for labor details. Marie screamed and fought as they dragged her son away, and Henri had to physically restrain her to prevent her from attacking the soldiers, which would have gotten her shot. The look in Thomas's eyes as they forced him into the truck would haunt Henri for the rest of his life, a mixture of fear, anger, and an unspoken plea for his father to do something, anything. That night, Henri made contact with the resistance. Through careful inquiry among trusted neighbors, he learned that a network existed, small cells operating independently to maintain security. A man came to his farm 3 nights later, arriving on foot through the fields, a shadow moving between shadows. He identified himself only as Renard, the fox, and he listened with intense interest as Henri described what he had created. Renard was perhaps 30, lean and hard-eyed, with the cautious movements of someone who had learned to expect danger from any direction. He examined the shotgun and the remaining ammunition with professional interest, asking technical questions that revealed his own military background. Henri explained the limitations, the low rate of fire, the damage to the weapon, the scarcity of materials to produce more rounds. Renard nodded, processing everything. The resistance had been desperately seeking ways to counter German armored vehicles. Stolen rifles and homemade explosives could damage unarmored trucks, but were largely ineffective against even the lightest armor. An ambush that couldn't disable the enemy's vehicles was a death sentence, as the partisans would be pinned down and destroyed by superior firepower. But a weapon that could punch through armor plating, that could disable vehicles or kill their occupants through the thin walls, that changed the calculus. Renard wanted Henri to produce more ammunition and train others in its manufacture. But Henri had another priority. He wanted information about where Thomas and the other laborers had been taken. Renard's expression softened slightly, the first crack in his professional demeanor. He understood. The war had made every father a desperate man, every son a potential casualty. He promised to make inquiries, to see what could be learned. Over the following months, Henri's workshop became a clandestine factory. Renard brought materials, tungsten salvaged from machine tools in abandoned factories, copper stripped from electrical systems, smokeless powder carefully stolen from German supply depots. Other men joined the operation, each one vetted carefully, each one bringing specific skills. André, who had worked in a munitions plant, helped refine the powder charges. Claude, a chemist before the war, developed better methods for bonding the copper jackets to the tungsten cores. They worked in shifts, never more than 3 people at once, always with lookouts posted. The danger was constant, German patrols were unpredictable, informants were everywhere, and a single mistake could bring the Gestapo crashing down on them all. Henri learned to sleep lightly, to wake at the slightest unusual sound, to read the faces of his neighbors for signs of suspicion or betrayal. The shotgun itself underwent modifications. With André's help, Henri reinforced the action, added a steel sleeve to support the barrel, and redesigned the stock to better absorb recoil. The weapon that emerged was heavier, cruder in appearance than the elegant sporting gun it had been, but far more durable. They test-fired it repeatedly, pushing it to understand its limits. The effective range was perhaps 50 meters for reliable accuracy, beyond which the tumbling effect of the projectile in the smooth bore became too pronounced. But at close range, within 30 meters, it could reliably penetrate the armor of ZKF's reconnaissance vehicles, and even the thinner side plates of some light tanks. Renard brought news of Thomas. The workers had been taken to a construction site on the Atlantic coast, part of the massive fortification effort the Germans called the Atlantic Wall. Conditions were brutal, but Thomas was alive. That knowledge sustained Henri through the long, dangerous nights of work. Every round he produced, every increment of improvement to the weapon, felt like a step toward bringing his son home. The first combat use of Henri's creation came in April of 1942. A resistance cell was planning to ambush a German convoy transporting captured resistance fighters to a prison in Caen. The intelligence was solid, the route predictable. But previous ambushes had failed because the Germans now traveled with armored escort vehicles that could suppress attackers while the valuable prisoners were rushed to safety. Renard proposed using Henry's shotgun to disable the lead escort vehicle, creating chaos that would allow the partisans to free the prisoners. Henry insisted on being the one to use it. This was his weapon, born from his anger and skill. More practically, he knew its quirks, its tendency to pull slightly left, the way the heavy trigger needed to be squeezed smoothly to avoid throwing off aim. Renard argued, but Henry was immovable. After all the work, all the risk, he would see it through. The ambush site was a curved section of road flanked by dense forest, chosen because it forced vehicles to slow down and limited visibility. Henry positioned himself 15 meters from the road, concealed in thick undergrowth, the modified shotgun resting on a fallen log for stability. Around him, scattered through the trees, 8 other resistance fighters waited with rifles, grenades, and desperate courage. The wait seemed endless. Henri's mind wandered to Marie, who had begged him not to go, to Thomas, working somewhere under guard, unaware his father was about to risk everything, to the wheat fields that would need planting soon, if he survived to see another season. The morning sun filtered through the spring leaves, and birds sang as though the world was not at war. Then he heard the engines. The convoy appeared around the curve, moving at perhaps 30 kilometers per hour. The lead vehicle was an SID KFZ armored car, its machine gun traversing slowly, the gunner scanning for threats. Behind it, 2 trucks with canvas covers carrying the prisoners. Behind them, another armored car as rear guard. Henry's mouth went dry. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to let his heart rate settle. He had one shot before the Germans would react, before machine guns would rake the forest with devastating fire. The lead vehicle came level with his position. Henry could see the driver through the forward viewport, a young face beneath a steel helmet, tense and alert. He raised the shotgun, settled the bead on the driver's compartment where he knew the armor was thinnest, and fired. The recoil punched his shoulder, the blast shockingly loud even outdoors. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed to happen. Then the armored car swerved violently, its engine revving as the driver's foot convulsed on the accelerator. The vehicle smashed into a tree with a grinding crash of metal on wood. The forest erupted with gunfire. Resistance fighters opened up on the trucks, targeting tires, and the Germans scrambling to deploy. Henri, hands shaking from adrenaline, broke open the shotgun and fumbled for another round. The rear armored car was reversing, its machine gun swinging toward the tree line. He knew he should run, seek cover, but something in him refused to waste the second shot. He loaded the round, aimed at the vehicle's side where it was momentarily exposed, and fired again. This shot was less fortunate. It struck the armor, but at an angle, deflecting rather than penetrating. Still, the impact must have startled the crew because the machine gun's burst went wild, tearing into the trees well above the concealed fighters. Then grenades were flying, smoke was everywhere, and Renard was shouting for everyone to fall back. Henri ran, branches whipping his face, lungs burning, certain at any moment he would feel the sledgehammer impact of bullets. But he made it. They all made it, melting back into the forest, using prepared routes and rally points practiced until they became instinct. Behind them, the Germans were in chaos. The lead vehicle was destroyed, its driver and gunner dead. 6 prisoners were freed, spirited away before reinforcements arrived. The Germans would flood the area with troops, would conduct reprisals against nearby villages, but the resistance had struck a blow that would echo through their networks. For Henri, the validation was bittersweet. His weapon had worked in the chaos and terror of combat. Lives had been saved, prisoners freed. But 2 resistance fighters had died in the ambush, and he had killed men himself, young soldiers far from home who probably hadn't wanted this war any more than he did. The weight of that settled on him in the days that followed. a heaviness that no amount of rationalization could fully lift. Word of the successful ambush spread through the resistance networks, and with it, requests for more of Henri's ammunition. Renard brought leaders from other cells, men and women who looked at Henri with something between hope and desperation. Could he produce more? Could he train others to manufacture the rounds? Could he develop versions for different weapons? Henri found himself at the center of a small but vital industry. His workshop expanded to include a second hidden location in Jacques' cellar. They established protocols for security, for moving materials, for disposing of metal shavings and other evidence. Every round produced was logged, tracked, assigned to specific operations. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. Through it all, Henri maintained his cover as a simple farmer. He tended his fields, delivered requisitioned grain to German collection points, even had cordial exchanges with the occupation troops who occasionally stopped by the farm. This double life required constant vigilance. One slip, one inconsistency, and everything would unravel. The strain showed in the lines deepening around his eyes, in the way his hands had developed a persistent tremor he couldn't quite control. Summer came with its heat and long days. The war news was mixed, reports carefully filtered through German censorship, but whispers spoke of massive battles in Russia, of America entering the war, of the tide perhaps beginning to turn. Henri allowed himself moments of hope, quickly suppressed by the reality of occupation that surrounded him daily. Then, in August, Renard brought information that changed everything. A German labor transport was scheduled to move workers from the Atlantic Wall construction sites to a new project in Belgium. Thomas would be on that transport. The route, the timing, even the number of guards, all known through sources Renard wouldn't identify. It was a chance to free Thomas, but it would require a major operation, multiple resistance cells working together, significant risk. Henri's immediate instinct was to demand involvement in the operation, but Renard was firm. Henri was too valuable now, too important to the broader effort. If he was captured, if he revealed under interrogation what he knew, entire networks could be compromised. The shotgun, the ammunition techniques, the contacts and procedures, all would be exposed. Renard promised that freeing Thomas would be a priority, but Henri had to stay back, had to continue the work. The argument between them was heated, the only time Henri had seen Renard lose his carefully maintained composure. But in the end, Henri understood. This was bigger than his personal pain, his need to save his son. The war required sacrifice, required men and women to set aside their individual desires for the collective struggle. It was a bitter understanding, one that left him feeling hollow. The operation to free the labor transport was scheduled for the last week of August. Henri threw himself into work, producing ammunition with obsessive focus, as though every round might somehow protect his son. Marie moved through the farmhouse like a ghost, pretending normalcy, while terror consumed her. Neither slept well, both listening for any sound that might signal news. The night of the operation, Henri couldn't stay in the house. He walked his fields under the stars, the wheat rustling around him, trying to pray though he had never been a religious man. He thought about Thomas as a boy, learning to drive the tractor, laughing at something simple and perfect. He thought about all the fathers across Europe, across the world, whose sons were in danger at that very moment. The weight of collective suffering felt crushing. Dawn came with no news. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Every vehicle on the distant road made Henri's heart race, wondering if it brought German troops or, impossibly, his son. By evening he had convinced himself the operation had failed, that Thomas was dead or recaptured, that he would never see him again. Then, as the sun was setting, painting the fields gold and red, a figure appeared walking up the farm road. Henri's breath caught. Even at a distance, even with the changes that hard labor had wrought, He knew that walk, that frame. Thomas was home. The reunion was wordless at first, just Henri and Marie holding their son, feeling the realness of him, the solid proof that prayers sometimes were answered. Thomas had lost weight, his hands were scarred from rough work, and his eyes held shadows that spoke of experiences Henri could only imagine. But he was alive, he was home, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Over the following days, as Thomas recovered his strength, he told them about the labor camps, about the brutal conditions and arbitrary cruelty, about the men who had died beside him. He told them about the rescue, how resistance fighters had struck with perfect coordination, overwhelming the guards before they could react. He didn't know the details of the operation, but he had heard from other freed workers that someone had disabled the escort vehicles with a weapon unlike anything the Germans expected. Henri never told his son about his role. Some things were better left unspoken. Thomas had returned to find his father seemingly unchanged, a farmer growing wheat and enduring occupation like everyone else. That illusion of normalcy was perhaps the greatest gift Henri could give him after everything he had endured. But the war continued, and Henri's work continued with it. Thomas, after recovering, insisted on joining the resistance despite his parents' objections. He had seen too much, suffered too much to sit idle while others fought. Henri understood, even as it terrified him. This was the nature of their time when ordinary men were forced to make extraordinary choices. Through 1943 and into 1944, Henri's operation grew. They had trained 5 other machinists in the ammunition production, established 3 separate workshops, and developed improvements to the original design. The ammunition had earned a reputation among resistance fighters, passed along in whispered conversations as something that actually worked, that gave them a fighting chance against German armor. The invasion of Normandy in June of 1944 brought new chaos and new hope. The skies filled with Allied aircraft, the roads with German reinforcements rushing toward the beaches. The resistance received orders to sabotage, harass, delay the German response in any way possible. Henri's ammunition saw intense use in those weeks, as partisans ambushed convoys, destroyed vehicles, and made the Germans pay for every kilometer they traveled. Henri watched from his fields as history unfolded around him. The German occupation, which had seemed permanent and unbreakable, was crumbling. The soldiers who had been so confident now looked hunted, desperate. Convoys moved at night, hugging routes where they thought resistance was weakest. But the resistance was everywhere, emboldened by the knowledge that liberation was coming. The town nearest Henri's farm was liberated in early August by Canadian troops advancing through Normandy. Henri stood with his neighbors as the tanks rolled through, as young soldiers grinned and waved, as people who had endured years of occupation wept with relief and joy. The celebration was tempered by loss, by the many who hadn't survived to see this day, but the liberation was real and profound. In the aftermath, as the tide of war moved east toward Germany itself, Henri returned to being simply a farmer. The workshop was cleaned, the hidden compartments sealed, the tools put away. He rebuilt the fence the Germans had torn down for firewood. He planted wheat that would be harvested in peace rather than requisitioned at gunpoint. The routine tasks of farming life, which had once seemed mundane, now felt precious and worth savoring. The modified shotgun he kept, unable to destroy it despite the risk. It represented too much, meant too much. He unloaded it, cleaned it carefully, and placed it in the back of a cabinet, wrapped in oilcloth. Perhaps someday he would tell someone the full story of what he had built and why. Or perhaps it would remain his secret, one man's defiance against an empire that had seemed invincible. Thomas survived the war, though he carried scars both visible and invisible. He took over the farm when Henri's hands finally grew too stiff with age to work the land. The wheat still grew each summer, golden and swaying, indifferent to the human struggles that had played out beneath the same sun and sky. In the years that followed, historians would document the resistance, the sabotage operations, the countless small acts of defiance that collectively helped turn the tide of war. Some would mention in passing the unusual armor-piercing ammunition that appeared in Normandy and proved surprisingly effective against light vehicles. But they would miss the story behind it, the practical ingenuity born from love and desperation, the farmer who became an improvised weapons designer because his son was taken and his land was occupied. Henri lived to see his grandchildren play in the same fields where he had hidden from German patrols, where he had tested weapons in secret, where he had waited for news of his son. He never spoke much about the war years, deflecting questions with vague generalities. Marie understood his silence. Some experiences ran too deep for words, carved into the soul in ways that language couldn't reach. The modified shotgun remained in its cabinet, a relic of a time when ordinary people were forced to become extraordinary, when a farmer's workshop became a factory of resistance, when love and anger and skill combined to create something that could pierce armor even cannons couldn't crack. It was a testament to human ingenuity in the face of tyranny, to the power of one person's determination to make a difference when the world demanded it. Years after the war, a researcher interested in resistance activities came to interview Henri. The man had heard stories, uncovered records, and pieced together enough to know that something significant had happened on this farm during the occupation. Henri sat with him in the same workshop where it had all taken place, now filled with ordinary farming equipment, no trace of its wartime purpose visible. The researcher asked direct questions. Henri gave indirect answers. Finally, the man asked outright if it was true that Henri had developed armor-piercing ammunition for resistance use. Henri considered for a long moment, looking out the workshop window at the wheat fields bathed in afternoon sun. Then he smiled slightly and said that many people had done many things during the war, that it was a time of invention born from necessity, and that perhaps some stories were better left to speculation than confirmation. The researcher left frustrated but respectful. He wrote about the operation in general terms, acknowledging the gaps in the record, the details that would never be fully known. Henri read the published account and found it satisfactory. The truth was there between the lines for those who wanted to see it, but the specifics that might have brought unwanted attention remained concealed. As Henri grew older, his hands that had once machined precision components now struggled with simple tasks. But his mind remained sharp, filled with memories of those years when every choice carried life or death weight. He thought often about the moral complexities, about the men he had killed through his invention, about whether the ends truly justified the means. He never arrived at comfortable answers, but he made peace with the ambiguity, understanding that war forces impossible choices and leaves everyone scarred. On clear nights, he would walk his land, following paths he knew by heart, listening to the sounds of the farm settling into darkness. Sometimes he would stop at the spot where he had test-fired the first successful round, where months of work had culminated in that moment of violent proof. The ground bore no mark of what had happened there, but Henri remembered everything: the weight of the weapon, the slam of recoil, the sight of metal pierced clean through. He thought about all the people whose lives had intersected with his during those years. Renard, whose real name Henri never learned, disappeared after the war, returning to whatever life he had put aside to fight. Jacques lived to see liberation, but died the following winter, his body finally giving out after years of stress. Many of the resistance fighters Henri had worked with were gone, some killed in action, others moved away to escape memories that haunted them. But the farm remained constant and demanding, requiring attention to cycles of planting and harvest that proceeded regardless of human drama. Henri found comfort in that continuity, in the knowledge that the land would be here long after he was gone, that the wheat would grow for his grandchildren and their children in turn. It was a form of victory more profound than any military triumph, the simple persistence of life and work in the face of forces that had tried to destroy both. Thomas eventually learned the full story, not from his father, but from piecing together fragments overheard from visiting resistance veterans, from connecting dates and events, from understanding in hindsight what his father had been doing during those long nights in the workshop. The knowledge changed how he saw Henri, adding layers of respect and sadness to the love he had always felt. They never discussed it directly, maintaining the fiction that Thomas didn't know, but the understanding passed between them in glances and careful silences. Marie carried her own burdens from those years, the terror of watching both her husband and son risk everything, the weight of keeping secrets, the countless nights spent listening for sounds that might mean disaster. But she also carried pride, the knowledge that when tyranny demanded submission, her family had chosen resistance. In her later years, she would tell her grandchildren carefully edited stories about the war, about how ordinary people found extraordinary courage when needed, about how even small acts of defiance mattered in the larger struggle. The weeks following Thomas's return were both joyous and tense. Henri noticed the changes in his son immediately, not just the physical toll of forced labor, but something deeper. Thomas would wake in the night, gasping, sometimes calling out in German, the language of his captors having invaded even his dreams. Marie would sit with him during these episodes, speaking softly until the terror passed. Henri watched helplessly, understanding that some wounds go beyond what any father can heal. But Thomas was resilient, inheriting his father's practical determination. Within 2 weeks, despite his parents' protests, he was working again, helping with the harvest, insisting that idle hands gave his mind too much room to wander to dark places. Henri understood this too, having spent countless nights in the workshop not just for the resistance, but to keep his own fears at bay. Work was a salve, a distraction, a way to feel useful when the world seemed designed to make you feel powerless. The resistance network had changed during Thomas's captivity. What had been scattered cells of desperate fighters had evolved into something more organized, more professional. Allied intelligence services had made contact, providing training, equipment, and coordination. The makeshift operations of the early occupation years were giving way to planned campaigns tied to broader strategic objectives. Henri's workshop became a regular stop for resistance couriers, young men and women who moved through the countryside carrying messages, supplies, and hope. One such courier was a woman named Elise, perhaps 25 years old, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a composure that spoke of experiences that had aged her beyond her years. She arrived one evening in October, carrying a request from regional resistance leadership. They wanted Henri to travel to a meeting in a town 40 kilometers away to discuss expanding production of his ammunition and training others in its manufacture. The risk was considerable. German security had intensified, checkpoints were frequent, and anyone traveling without clear purpose attracted suspicion. Henri's initial instinct was to refuse. The farm needed attention, winter was approaching, and every trip away from his property increased the danger of exposure. But Elise was persuasive, explaining how other regions were facing similar challenges with armored vehicles, how Henri's innovation could multiply its impact if shared properly. She spoke of operations that had failed because fighters lacked the means to disable enemy armor, of brave men and women killed because their weapons were inadequate. Her words carried weight because they came without manipulation or exaggeration, just honest assessment of tactical reality. Marie opposed the trip vehemently. They had Thomas back, the family was whole again. Why risk that for a meeting that others could surely handle? But Henri saw in his son's eyes a reflection of his own thinking. This wasn't about a single family anymore. The occupation had made everyone's fate interconnected. Safety in isolation was an illusion when tyranny controlled everything around you. If Henri's knowledge could save lives elsewhere, refusing to share it was itself a form of abandonment. The journey to the meeting was tense from the start. Henri travelled by bicycle, his papers identifying him as a farmer visiting relatives, a common enough excuse. The modified shotgun and ammunition stayed hidden on the farm, but he carried detailed drawings and notes concealed in the bicycle frame, technical specifications that would allow trained machinists to reproduce his work. If discovered, these documents would be his death sentence, but they were too valuable to risk loss if something happened to him. The first checkpoint came after only 8 kilometers. 2 bored German soldiers, young men who looked like they would rather be anywhere else, examined his papers with perfunctory interest. One asked the purpose of his travel, and Henri explained about visiting his sister who had fallen ill, offering details about her fictional condition with the confidence of a man telling the truth. The soldiers waved him through, returning to their conversation about some girl in the nearest town. Henri's heart rate didn't return to normal for another kilometer. The meeting took place in the cellar of a butcher shop, accessed through a hidden entrance in the cold storage room. 12 people attended, representing resistance cells from across the region. Henri recognized Renard, who nodded greeting but maintained the professional distance that had characterized their entire relationship. The others were strangers, men and women whose names Henri never learned, identified only by code names that probably changed regularly. A former army officer named Corbeau, the Raven, led the discussion. He was perhaps 40, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, though the lines around his eyes spoke of stress and loss. Corbeau outlined the strategic situation. Allied advances had bogged down after the initial breakout from Normandy. German resistance was stiffening, particularly around key positions where armor played a crucial defensive role. The resistance could contribute by harassing supply lines, but effectiveness required the ability to neutralize armored vehicles that escorted convoys and protected critical infrastructure. Corbeau turned to Henri, asking him to explain his ammunition design to the group. Henri felt suddenly awkward, a farmer standing before people who included military professionals, engineers, and educated resistance leaders. But as he began describing the technical principles, the iterative testing process, the specific metallurgy that made it work, he found his confidence. This was his domain, knowledge earned through practical experimentation, and these people needed what he knew. The questions came fast. Could the design work in different barrel sizes? What were the material requirements? How long did production take per round? What was the failure rate? Henri answered each query as honestly as possible, neither minimizing the challenges nor exaggerating the capabilities. He explained that this wasn't a miracle weapon, that it required skilled machining, quality materials, and careful quality control. But within those constraints, it worked, and that made it valuable. A woman identified only as Merle, the Blackbird, who Renard quietly indicated was a demolitions expert, asked pointed questions about the physics of penetration, about how the projectile behaved on impact, whether it fragmented or remained intact. Her questions revealed deep technical knowledge, and Henri found himself discussing terminal ballistics at a level he had never articulated before. The conversation pushed his understanding, forcing him to explain principles he had intuited through experimentation but never formally analyzed. The meeting concluded with a plan. Henri would train 2 machinists, one from each of the other major resistance groups in the region. These men would learn not just the process, but the reasoning behind each step, enabling them to adapt the design to local materials and conditions. Production would be decentralized, reducing the risk that a single raid could eliminate the capability. Quality control standards would be established, with test firing protocols to ensure each batch met minimum performance requirements. As the meeting broke up, Corbeau pulled Henri aside. The older man's expression was serious, almost grave. He thanked Henri for his contribution, then added something that would stay with Henri for the rest of his life. Corbeau said that in war, victory often comes down to small advantages, to incremental improvements in capability that collectively shift the balance. Henri's innovation wouldn't win the war alone, but it might save the lives of fighters who would go on to participate in actions that did matter strategically. Sometimes, Corbeau concluded, the greatest contributions are the ones that enable others to succeed. The return journey came 2 days later, after Henri spent time with the 2 machinists who would carry his knowledge forward. Both were skilled tradesmen, one a toolmaker from Lyon, the other a mechanic from Rennes. They absorbed the information quickly, asking intelligent questions, taking notes that they would later encode and hide. Henri felt confident they would succeed, that his work would replicate and spread. But the return trip brought disaster. At a checkpoint 10 kilometers from home, German soldiers were conducting intensive searches, pulling apart bicycles, examining papers with unusual scrutiny. Henri learned from other travelers waiting in line that there had been a sabotage action the previous night, a rail line blown up, and the Germans were sweeping the area for suspects. His papers were legitimate, his cover story solid, but the documents hidden in his bicycle frame were death if discovered. Henri watched the searches with growing dread. The soldiers were using dogs, were dismantling vehicles completely. There was no way that concealed documents would survive this level of inspection. He was perhaps 5th in line, with nowhere to run, no way to destroy the evidence without drawing attention. His mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in capture or death. Then, unexpectedly, chaos. An old truck further back in the line backfired, a loud bang that in the tense atmosphere sounded like a gunshot. Soldiers spun around, weapons raised, shouting, dogs barked. For a moment, everyone froze, unsure what was happening. In that instant of confusion, Henri acted on pure instinct. He pulled the documents from their hiding place, wadded them into his mouth, and began chewing desperately, swallowing paper as fast as he could manage. The paper was thick, resistant, tasted of metal and ink. He gagged, forced himself to continue, swallowing chunks of partially chewed documentation. His eyes watered, his throat convulsed, but he kept going, destroying months of careful documentation to save his life. By the time the soldiers determined the truck had simply misfired, by the time attention returned to the checkpoint, Henri had consumed most of the critical pages, the remainder shredded into pieces too small to read. When his turn came, the search was thorough, but found nothing incriminating. The soldier examining his bicycle even checked the frame where the documents had been hidden, but the space was empty. Innocent. Henri was waved through, his papers returned, his cover intact. He rode away slowly, maintaining the appearance of a simple farmer annoyed by delays, while his stomach churned with the documentary evidence he had ingested. He made it another 2 kilometers before pulling into a small grove and vomiting violently, his body rejecting the paper, ink, and stress. He knelt there for long minutes, shaking, understanding how close he had come to disaster. The documents were gone. The knowledge they contained now existed only in his memory and in the minds of the 2 men he had trained. It would have to be enough. Marie knew something had happened the moment she saw him. Henri's face was pale, his hands trembled slightly, despite his attempts at composure. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Henri told her everything. She listened without interruption, her hand gripping his tightly, and when he finished, she said simply that they had to be more careful, that losing him would destroy her more completely than any German occupation could manage. It wasn't a plea to stop, she understood him too well for that, but rather a statement of stakes, a reminder of what hung in the balance. The winter of 1942 into 43 was brutal, not just in weather, but in the escalating violence of occupation. The Germans, facing setbacks in Russia and North Africa, became more ruthless in their treatment of occupied territories. Reprisals for resistance actions grew harsher. Entire villages could be punished for the actions of a few. Public executions became common. Bodies left hanging as warnings. The message was clear: submission or death, no middle ground. Henri's workshop continued production through the harsh months, though at reduced capacity. Heating was impossible without drawing attention, so they worked in bitter cold, fingers stiff, movements slowed. The tungsten became harder to source as the Germans tightened control over industrial materials. Several times, production stopped completely for weeks, while Renard's network located new supplies, often salvaged from increasingly unlikely sources. Thomas became more deeply involved in resistance activities, progressing from courier work to more direct actions. Henri and Marie lived in constant fear, but they couldn't stop him any more than he could stop them. The family had become what many families across occupied Europe had become: a unit of resistance, each member contributing according to their capabilities, all bound by love and shared purpose into something larger than individual survival. In March of 1943, the workshop nearly met its end. A collaborator, a local man who traded information for money and preferential treatment, became suspicious of nocturnal activity around Henri's farm. He reported his concerns to the German security service. 3 Gestapo officers arrived unannounced one afternoon, their black car rolling up the farm road like a hearse. Henri, working in the visible portion of his workshop on legitimate farm repairs, had perhaps 30 seconds warning from a prearranged signal, a neighbor hanging laundry in a specific pattern. It was enough time to activate the concealment, to slide the false wall into place, to scatter tools and parts consistent with farm equipment maintenance. When the Gestapo entered, they found an unremarkable workshop, cluttered and greasy, containing nothing more suspicious than a partially disassembled hay baler. The lead officer, a thin man with glasses that magnified cold eyes, questioned Henri for over an hour. Where did he go at night? Who visited the farm? What was his relationship with known resistance members? Henri answered with a farmer's stolid patience, explaining that he worked late because equipment broke at inconvenient times, that neighbors visited because rural communities took care of each other, that he knew nothing of resistance activities and wanted only to be left alone to farm his land. They searched the house, the barn, the workshop. They were methodical but not inspired, going through expected motions rather than conducting the kind of intensive search that would have discovered the hidden compartments. Marie, showing remarkable composure, offered them coffee, played the role of a simple farmer's wife, confused and frightened by their presence. Her performance was flawless, and Henri felt a surge of love for this woman who had found reserves of courage she probably didn't know she possessed. After 3 hours, the Gestapo left, apparently satisfied that the informant had been mistaken or malicious. But the close call forced changes. Production moved entirely to Jacques' cellar for 2 months, until the heat of investigation cooled. Henri limited his visible involvement, working more as consultant than active machinist. The network adapted, showing the resilience that characterized effective resistance organizations. The informant who had reported Henri was found dead a week later, his body discovered in a ditch with a single bullet wound. Henri never knew who had carried out the execution. Renard never mentioned it, and Henri never asked. He felt neither satisfaction nor guilt at the man's death, only a grim understanding that betrayal carried consequences in a world where survival itself had become a form of warfare. Spring brought new life to the farm and new urgency to the resistance. Intelligence indicated major German operations planned for the summer, reinforcements moving through the region, supply depots being established. The resistance received orders to intensify sabotage, to strain German logistics in advance of anticipated Allied operations. Henri's ammunition saw increased demand, with requests coming not just from local cells, but from groups operating across Normandy and Brittany. The production expanded to include a third workshop, this one in the cellar of a church whose priest had decided that resisting tyranny was a higher moral calling than maintaining neutrality. Father Michel was an elderly man with arthritic hands that could no longer perform the delicate machining work, but his cellar provided secure space and his moral authority helped recruit assistance. Young men who might have hesitated to join armed resistance were willing to help when a priest framed it as righteous duty. Henri found himself spending more time teaching than producing, training a growing network of machinists in the techniques he had developed. Each training session was a risk, each new person a potential security breach, but the demand was undeniable. The ammunition had proven itself in enough engagements that fighters specifically requested it for operations involving armored targets. That reputation, earned round by painful round, gave Henri satisfaction even as it increased the pressure. The technical challenges never ceased. Each batch of materials had slightly different properties, requiring adjustments to tolerances and powder loads. The copper for jackets came from increasingly unlikely sources: salvaged wire, old pipes, even electrical components stripped from abandoned buildings. Henri developed tests to assess material quality, simple procedures that allowed other machinists to determine if a particular batch of copper or tungsten was suitable for ammunition production. In June of 1943, Henri's ammunition participated in what became known among resistance fighters as the Weiher Bridge Action. A German convoy carrying ammunition and fuel was scheduled to cross a strategic bridge. Resistance planners wanted to destroy both the convoy and the bridge, cutting a supply route for weeks. The plan required precise timing. Disable the escort vehicles with armor-piercing fire, destroy the supply trucks with explosives, then blow the bridge before reinforcements arrived. Thomas was part of the assault team, a fact Henri learned only after the operation concluded successfully. 8 resistance fighters had positioned themselves overlooking the bridge approach, armed with a mix of weapons, including 2 shotguns loaded with Henri's ammunition. When the convoy appeared, the shooters engaged the escort vehicles first, achieving multiple penetrating hits that disabled both armored cars within seconds. With the escorts neutralized, the fighters then engaged the softer-skinned supply trucks with conventional weapons and grenades. The entire convoy was destroyed. Explosives demolished the bridge, and the resistance team escaped without casualties. Henri learned these details from Renard, who visited specifically to report the success. The operation had achieved all objectives, denying the Germans critical supplies and disrupting their logistics in the region. More importantly, from a resistance perspective, it had been conducted with precision and professionalism, proving that French fighters could execute complex operations successfully. Morale benefits were as valuable as the material damage inflicted. The news that Thomas had participated filled Henri with conflicting emotions. Pride that his son had conducted himself bravely and effectively. Terror at the risks Thomas had taken and would continue taking. Frustration that he hadn't been informed beforehand, though he understood the security reasons. Marie, when she learned, was less conflicted. She made Thomas promise, a promise she knew he probably couldn't keep, to be more careful, to take fewer risks. Thomas agreed, holding his mother while she cried, and Henri saw in his son's eyes the knowledge that some promises are made to provide comfort rather than because they can be honored. The summer of 1943 brought relentless heat and equally relentless German security operations. The successful resistance actions had provoked harsh responses. Random checkpoints appeared without warning. Curfews were strictly enforced. Anyone traveling required extensive documentation. The pressure was designed to make resistance activity unsustainable, to force the population into fearful compliance. But the pressure had an opposite effect on many. The more brutal the occupation became, the more people quietly assisted the resistance, even if they didn't actively fight. Farmers provided food, shopkeepers passed messages, doctors treated wounded fighters without reporting them, teachers helped forge documents. The resistance became woven into the fabric of community life, impossible to extract without destroying the community itself. Henri's role evolved again. He became a problem solver for the broader resistance network, addressing technical challenges that arose in different cells. A group in Caen needed to adapt the ammunition for a different gauge shotgun. A team in Bayeux wanted to know if the same principles could apply to rifle rounds. Fighters near Saint-Lô needed advice on metallurgy for a separate project. Henri found himself conducting a distributed technical consultation, answering questions through coded messages, never meeting most of the people he advised. The autumn of 1943 arrived with a sense of change in the air, subtle but undeniable. Radio broadcasts, carefully tuned to forbidden Allied stations in secret moments, spoke of German retreats in Italy, of Soviet advances in the East, of American industrial might producing weapons and equipment in staggering quantities. The certainty of German victory, which had seemed absolute in 1940, was cracking like ice in spring thaw. The question was no longer if the Germans would be defeated, but when and at what cost to those still living under occupation. Henri observed these changes in small details. German soldiers who had once been arrogant now looked tired, even fearful. Officers who had treated the French with contempt now sometimes showed courtesy, as if anticipating a future where roles might reverse. Supply columns that had once been regular and well-maintained now appeared sporadic, with vehicles in poor repair, equipment obviously worn beyond normal service life. The Wehrmacht was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, and even in remote Normandy the symptoms were visible. The resistance network evolved with these changing conditions. What had been primarily a sabotage and intelligence-gathering organization began preparing for more ambitious operations. Allied command was making contact through radio and parachuted agents, providing guidance on how resistance forces could support an eventual invasion. The precise timing remained unknown, but everyone understood that liberation would come through Normandy's beaches, that this region would become a battlefield, and that preparation now might mean survival later. Henri's technical consultation role expanded into strategic planning. Resistance leaders wanted his input on how best to disrupt German armor in fluid combat conditions, very different from the ambush scenarios that had characterized most operations thus far. The invasion would bring chaos, with German reinforcements rushing toward the beaches while Allied forces pushed inland. Resistance fighters would need to operate in this confusion, hitting targets of opportunity, creating additional disorder that would multiply the Germans' problems. These discussions happened in the church cellar, in Jacques' workshop, occasionally in Henri's own home when security conditions allowed. Maps spread across tables showed German positions, supply routes, communication lines. Henri, who had never considered himself a military strategist, found himself analyzing problems of mobility, fields of fire, likely German responses to different resistance actions. His practical mind, trained to solve mechanical problems, adapted surprisingly well to tactical questions. One particular problem consumed many planning sessions: how to deal with the heavy German armor that would inevitably appear once the invasion began. Hendry's ammunition could penetrate light armored vehicles, reconnaissance cars, and the thin sides of some tanks, but it was useless against the frontal armor of Panthers or Tigers. Yet these massive tanks would be priority targets, blocking roads, dominating approaches. Some method had to be found to at least delay them, even if not destroy them. The solution came from André, who proposed a combination approach. Use Henry's ammunition to eliminate accompanying infantry and lighter escort vehicles, isolating the heavy tanks. Then employ magnetic mines, still being developed by the Resistance's improvised ordnance cells, against tracks and wheels. A mobility kill would be as effective as destruction, perhaps more so, as disabled tanks blocked roads for those following. It wasn't elegant, but wars were rarely won by elegant solutions. Effectiveness mattered, not beauty. Training intensified through the winter. Resistance fighters practiced with the weapons they would actually have, which meant a motley collection of hunting rifles, old military weapons hidden since 1940, a few British Sten guns parachuted in by the RAF, and of course shotguns loaded with Henry's special ammunition. Young men who 6 months earlier had never fired a weapon were taught marksmanship, small unit tactics, battlefield medicine. The training happened in forests and abandoned quarries, always with lookouts, always ready to scatter if German patrols appeared. Thomas became an instructor, his experience from operations giving him credibility with newer recruits. Henry watched his son teach others how to move quietly, how to select firing positions, how to maintain calm under stress. The transformation from farm boy to combat veteran had happened so quickly, compressed by war's urgency into a span of months that should have been years. Part of Henry mourned for the innocence lost, but another part felt pride seeing Thomas become a leader, someone others looked to for guidance. Marie found her own role in the expanding resistance infrastructure. Her farmhouse became a safe location for meetings, her kitchen a place where fighters could eat a real meal and feel momentarily human. She organized a network of women who gathered intelligence, noting German movements, monitoring which roads were heavily patrolled, observing patterns in occupation forces' behavior. This information, seemingly trivial in isolation, became valuable when aggregated and analyzed, revealing patterns that enabled better operation planning. In February of 1944, a British agent parachuted into the region, a captain named Harrison, who spoke French with an accent that he claimed was Belgian, but that fooled no one. Harrison brought radios, weapons, and most importantly, direct communication with Allied command. He also brought questions about resistance capabilities, wanting detailed assessments of how many fighters could be mobilized, what weapons they possessed, what operations they could realistically conduct. Harrison was particularly interested in Henry's ammunition, examining samples with professional interest, asking about production capacity and reliability. He explained that British intelligence had collected reports about unusually effective resistance attacks on German armor. An investigation had traced many back to ammunition manufactured using Henry's techniques. The British were impressed and wanted to standardize production, potentially airdropping tungsten and other materials to support increased manufacturing. This validation from Allied command meant more to Henry than he would have predicted. For years, he had worked in obscurity, never quite certain whether his efforts mattered in the vast scope of the war. To learn that British intelligence had noticed that reports of his ammunition's effectiveness had reached London gave his work a context and importance that transcended the immediate. He wasn't just helping local resistance, he was contributing to the broader Allied effort. But Harrison also brought sobering realism. He explained that the coming invasion would be brutal, that casualties would be horrific on all sides, that the Germans would fight with desperate ferocity to prevent their defeat. Resistance forces should prepare for the worst, should understand that many wouldn't survive liberation. It wasn't meant to discourage, Harrison said, but to ensure people made decisions with eyes open, understanding the true cost of the fight they were joining. The spring of 1944 brought an almost unbearable tension. Everyone knew the invasion was coming soon. German forces were clearly preparing, constructing beach obstacles, laying mines, building fortifications along the coast. Rommel himself had visited the region, inspecting defenses, demanding improvements. The increased German activity made resistance operations more dangerous, but also more necessary. Every German unit tied down by security concerns was one less available to contest the beaches. Henry's workshops operated at maximum capacity, producing ammunition faster than ever before. Materials arrived via RAF supply drops, parachuted containers filled with tungsten, copper powder and other necessities. The British even provided small amounts of manufactured tungsten projectiles, machined to precise specifications in English factories, which served as patterns for Henry's machinists to copy. Production became almost industrial in scale, though still distributed across multiple hidden locations for security. The technical challenges never ceased, but the network Henry had trained was capable of solving most problems independently now. When a batch of powder proved too volatile, machinists adjusted the loads accordingly. When copper supplies varied in quality, they modified jacket designs to compensate. The system Henry had created had become self-sustaining, capable of adapting and continuing even without his direct involvement. This organizational resilience, more than any single technical achievement, was perhaps his greatest contribution to the resistance effort. In early June, the word finally came. The invasion was imminent, possibly within days. Resistance cells received activation codes via BBC radio broadcasts, seemingly innocuous phrases that triggered pre-planned operations. Henry's network received orders to begin immediate sabotage of German communications and transportation in their sector, with emphasis on preventing German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches quickly. The night of June 5th, Henry barely slept, listening to distant thunder that might have been storms or might have been something else. By dawn, the truth was undeniable. Allied bombers filled the skies in formation so vast they blocked the sun. The constant drone of engines, mixed with occasional explosions, created a soundscape unlike anything Henry had experienced. The invasion had begun, and with it, the final phase of occupation. Resistance operations launched simultaneously across the region. Rail lines were cut, bridges demolished, communication cables severed. German units trying to move toward the fighting found roads blocked, vehicles ambushed, every kilometer contested. Henry's ammunition saw intensive use as resistance fighters engaged German convoys, targeting the armored escorts that protected valuable supplies and reinforcements. The months of preparation, training and production culminated in a fury of activity that turned the German rear areas into a second front. Thomas participated in an operation to delay a panzer battalion moving toward the beaches. The plan was audacious: create a roadblock on a narrow section of road between steep embankments, force the German column to stop, then attack from both flanks. Henry's ammunition would be crucial, used to disable the lighter vehicles, while heavier weapons and improvised explosives targeted the tanks themselves. It was dangerous, bordering on suicidal, but it might delay the German armor long enough for Allied forces to consolidate their beachheads. Marie knew her son was involved in something significant, though Thomas hadn't provided details. She spent the day working mechanically through farm chores, her mind elsewhere, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Henry worked in his shop, unable to focus, hands busy with meaningless tasks, while his thoughts remained with his son. The waiting was agony, each hour stretching endlessly, every distant explosion triggering fear that casualties had occurred. Thomas returned 36 hours later, exhausted, wounded slightly with shrapnel cuts on his left arm, but alive. The operation had been partially successful. They had disabled several vehicles, killed dozens of German soldiers, and delayed the Panzer Battalion for nearly 8 hours before being forced to withdraw. 2 resistance fighters had died, several more wounded seriously. Thomas spoke little about the details, his eyes distant, processing experiences that would mark him permanently. The weeks following the invasion were chaos beyond description. German forces, fighting desperately to contain the Allied beachhead, became increasingly ruthless toward the civilian population. Reprisals for resistance actions were immediate and brutal. Villages suspected of harboring fighters were sometimes burned entirely, inhabitants killed or deported. The violence escalated as the Wehrmacht recognized it was fighting for survival, no longer concerned with maintaining any pretense of lawful occupation. Henri's farm nearly didn't survive this period. A German unit, retreating from an Allied advance, decided to requisition the property as a defensive position. 30 soldiers arrived, began digging foxholes, preparing to make a stand. Henri and Marie watched helplessly as their fields were carved up, buildings occupied, years of work transformed into a battlefield. The modified shotgun and all evidence of ammunition production were hidden in a space Henri had prepared for exactly this contingency, beneath the barn floor, sealed and hopefully undetectable. For 3 days, German soldiers occupied the farm. Henri and Marie were confined to the kitchen, permitted to cook for the troops, but otherwise treated as inconveniences. Henri listened to the soldiers talk, young men from all across Germany, some barely older than Thomas, all exhibiting the hollow-eyed fatigue of an army that knew it was beaten but had to keep fighting anyway. Some were veterans from the Eastern Front, hard men who had seen things that left them emotionally dead. Others were recent conscripts, terrified and trying to hide it. The battle, when it came, was brief and devastating. Allied armor appeared on the road, supported by infantry and aircraft. The Germans fought from prepared positions, their machine guns and anti-tank weapons creating brutal crossfire. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and lacking artillery or air support. Within 2 hours, it was over. Half the German defenders were dead, the rest captured or fled. The farm had been transformed into a cratered, smoking ruin, buildings riddled with bullets, fields torn by tank tracks and explosions. Henri and Marie emerged from the cellar where they had sheltered during the fighting. Their home was damaged, but structure intact. The barn had taken several direct hits and was burning. The workshop, miraculously, had survived mostly unscathed, though a shell had blown out one wall. The wheat fields that should have been weeks from harvest were destroyed, trampled and burned beyond recovery. Years of work, gone in an afternoon of violence. But they were alive, and liberation was real. Allied soldiers, speaking English with accents Henri couldn't identify, checked on them with genuine concern, offered medical attention, provided food from their supplies. One young lieutenant who spoke some French apologized for the destruction, explained that war was terrible for everyone, promised that help would come for rebuilding. His sincerity was touching, though Henri understood that promises made during combat rarely translated to peacetime realities. Thomas found them 2 days later, having fought his way through the fluid combat that characterized the breakout from the beachhead. The reunion was emotional. 3 people who had survived when so many hadn't, holding each other amid the ruins of their farm. Thomas had aged visibly, his face bearing new scars and an expression that Henri recognized from mirrors, the look of someone who had seen violence that changed them fundamentally. But his son was alive, and liberation was coming, and perhaps that was enough. The liberation of their region came in early August, Canadian forces pushing through against diminishing German resistance. The soldiers who arrived were tired, bearing their own scars from weeks of brutal fighting, but they were victorious and they were liberators. The population greeted them with genuine joy, years of suppressed emotion erupting in celebrations that mixed laughter with tears, relief with grief for all that had been lost. Henri watched from the ruins of his farm as history unfolded around him. The German occupation, which had seemed permanent and unbreakable, was crumbling. The soldiers who had been so confident now looked hunted, desperate. Convoys moved east in retreat, rather than west in conquest. The machinery of tyranny was breaking down, and with it, the fear that had defined daily life for 4 years. In the aftermath, as the tide of war moved east toward Germany itself, Henri returned to being simply a farmer. The workshop was cleaned, the hidden compartments unsealed, and then sealed permanently, filled with concrete to erase all evidence. The tools were put away, the technical drawings burned. He rebuilt the fence the Germans had torn down for firewood. He planted wheat that would be harvested in peace, rather than requisitioned at gunpoint. The routine tasks of farming life, which had once seemed mundane, now felt precious and worth savoring. The modified shotgun he kept, unable to destroy it despite the risk. It represented too much, meant too much. He unloaded it, cleaned it carefully, and placed it in the back of a cabinet, wrapped in oilcloth. Perhaps someday he would tell someone the full story of what he had built and why. Or perhaps it would remain his secret, one man's defiance against an empire that had seemed invincible. Thomas survived the war, though he carried scars both visible and invisible. He took over the farm when Henri's hands finally grew too stiff with age to work the land. The wheat still grew each summer, golden and swaying, indifferent to the human struggles that had played out beneath the same sun and sky. The modified shotgun remained in its cabinet, aging slowly, its metal developing the patina of time, its wood darkening with years. Occasionally, Thomas would take it out, feel its weight, examine the crude but effective reinforcements his father had added. He never fired it, never even considered it. The weapon had served its purpose and earned its rest. It was a memorial as much as an artifact, honoring a time and choices that shaped everything that followed. Henri died in 1978, in his sleep, after a life that spanned some of history's most turbulent decades. His funeral was well attended, not just by family and neighbors, but by men who traveled from distant parts of France, elderly now, who shook Thomas's hand and spoke vaguely but meaningfully about Henri's contributions during the war. They understood what Henri had been, what he had done, even if the world at large never would. In the years since, the story of the farmer who built armor-piercing ammunition has become one of those half-remembered fragments of history, a tale that surfaces occasionally in discussions of resistance ingenuity, but lacks the documentation to fully verify. The technical achievement, remarkable for its time and circumstances, has been largely forgotten in an age of sophisticated weapons and precision engineering. But for those who lived through that time, who benefited from Henri's work, or knew the man himself, the story remains vivid and important. The farm still operates, now run by Thomas's children, its fields still producing wheat under the same sky that witnessed occupation and liberation. The workshop still stands, though it is filled with modern equipment now, serving the needs of contemporary agriculture. If you looked carefully, you might find marks in the concrete floor where heavy machinery once stood, or notice the slightly different color of mortar where a false wall was eventually removed. But these traces mean nothing without context, without the story to give them significance. This is the legacy of Henri Dubois, a man who transformed necessity into innovation, who used the skills of a lifetime to create something that helped resist tyranny when resistance seemed futile. His story reminds us that history is not made only by generals and politicians, by grand strategies and large armies. Sometimes history is made in workshops and barns, by ordinary people pushed to extraordinary measures. by love that refuses to accept powerlessness, by ingenuity born from desperation and shaped by courage. The shotgun that hacked armor still exists somewhere, perhaps in a museum collection mislabeled as a standard wartime weapon, perhaps in a private collection whose owner doesn't know its true history, perhaps still in that cabinet on the farm, waiting for someone to recognize what it represents. Wherever it is, it stands as testament to one man's refusal to accept defeat, to his determination that even when facing armored might with agricultural tools, innovation and will, could level the field. It is a reminder that seemingly invincible challenges can be pierced, that ordinary people possess extraordinary capacity when circumstances demand it, and that the human spirit, properly motivated, can crack armor even cannons couldn't breach.